Simcha Rothman, great to be with you on CBN News. The law has passed. What's next?
If you ask me what's next, I'm not a prophet. But if you ask me what I want the next step to be, I would say I hope that members from the opposition that openly supported this kind of reform in the past, and other people that care about the state of Israel, care about its economy, care about its security, will come back to their senses, sit and talk like normal people, like it usually happens in this building, and find a wide agreement, and it's very easy to reach it if there is good faith and goodwill. From our side, there is goodwill and good faith. I hope people from the opposition will talk. And then the next step is up to the negotiation. Mm-hmm. If we reach agreements on certain issues and certain issues need more time, we'll go with what we agreed on. Everyone in Israel understands the problem today. No one in Israel says there is not a problem with the justice system. But the way to change it, and the fact that I also prefer and think it's very important that it will be with wide agreements. But you cannot agree with yourself. You need someone else to agree with. And if the other side just runs away from any agreement, then you cannot give them the veto. But besides giving them veto on legislation, we're willing to talk about everything.
Who are the members of the opposition that actually proposed very similar or the exact legislation that you had proposed and just passed?
So first, Gideon Sa'ar, it was in his website, word by word, the legislation, almost word by word. The idea that the reasonableness clause, which I know that sometimes lost in translation, no one wants the government to act unreasonably. That's not the question. The question is, who is the judge of what's reasonable and what's not? And Israel is the only country that I know of that the decision of who will be in the government, who the minister will be, what kind of policy you will adopt, the court can say it's unreasonable without showing any problem with the law or the process, just doesn't like the outcome, and says, I will decide instead of you. This is what the court in Israel did in the 80s. Until the 80s, the court did not do it. And that needs to be changed. And the idea is, if you want to do it on a low-level official, by all means. But if you want to do it on elected officials, on the government, on the minister, on the prime minister, you're not actually fighting with the government. It's not only a problem of separation of powers. It's a question of democracy. When a minister in Israel decided that he does not want to appoint someone who calls for people not to go in the army, he thinks she shouldn't be taking a very high-ranking position because the message it transfers to the public in Israel that calling for soldiers to dodge the draft is okay. And that's a public message that a minister can and should, if you ask me, think about when he appoints someone. The court said it's unreasonable. Why it's unreasonable? I think it's reasonable. The voters of this minister think it's reasonable. And when the court says it's unreasonable, it basically says, I decide and not the public. And that's not democratic. No other country will take it.
You mentioned Gideon Sa'ar. Any other leaders of the opposition?
So Gideon Sa'ar actually wrote it, speaking about it openly. There are a number of speeches, public speeches, when Yair Lapid said exactly that. He said that the court, using this reasonableness test, actually, and I'm using this as a quote, did a hostile takeover on the government of Israel. That's a speech Yair Lapid gave in 2014, in 2016. This problem, and I'm not even talking about law professors and leaders of the judges and Supreme Court justices and chief justices that criticized the use of this reasonableness test by the court for many, many years. I'm talking political players that are actually on the field today that were criticizing it in a very harsh terms. And now, because we offered it and they're not part of the coalition, they're bad-mouthing the same thing that they voted on and spoke about it before.
And why would they do that?
Because the demonstrations are not really about the reform in the justice system. And the outrage that the coalition, that the opposition members are fostering, it's not about the justice system. It's about the fact that they lost the elections. And they say, we do not accept this fact. And they went out and planned those protests way before we started doing anything. Because they did not, way before the government was formed, this protest machine came into being with budgets and ideas and strategies, just because they did not accept the fact that Netanyahu is the prime minister. And it's not new. People say, oh, what about the instability? We had 5 elections in 3 years before I was chair of this committee passing those laws. 5 elections in 3 years, that's not stable. Why there wasn't stability in the political system in Israel? Because first, the justice system created problems with stability. We went to elections, early elections, because of the draft law that was enacted time and again and canceled by the court. And when you cannot solve issues, pressing issues through the parliament, you are getting frustrated. The public gets frustrated. The politicians get frustrated, and then we go to elections. That's creating instability, and also because major parts of Israeli politics fear say, I do not accept the fact that Netanyahu is the prime minister, and he was voted for by the majority of the public in Israel, and we are boycotting him, and he is not a legitimate leader, and we won't sit with him, and we won't talk with him. And together with the ultra-Orthodox and together with the right, it's all together. And therefore, we had 5 elections in 3 years before I started doing anything.
You said, who is behind these protests?
There are many people that are involved with it. A large money. You have names. First, openly, you have former prime ministers like Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert that inciting in words that you wouldn't imagine, some of them actually calling for civil war. Crazy talk, really crazy talk by people that the public in Israel voted out. And they're frustrated, and I understand why. Because they were voted out, and whenever they tried talking about returning to the political sphere, they failed miserably, specifically Ehud Barak. And he's frustrated, investing a lot of money in this, and talks about it, and he's behind a lot of those protests openly. It's not a secret. A lot of people that are very influential people in the media, leaders of big ad companies. If you saw the black pages on the newspapers this week, it wasn't an editorial decision. It was a paid ads. Can you imagine how much it costs to do this? Who pays for this? Now, I'm saying if you want to protest, it's okay. But the amount of effort that is invested in delegitimizing the political and democratical choice of the public in Israel and outside of Israel, and in the world, is really not democratic. It's not democratic to go. You can protest a certain act of the government. It's okay. That's democracy. But if you protest and says, you, the public, you voted in the way that I don't like, and therefore I will make your life miserable, I will disrupt your life, that's not a democratic way to behave.
You mentioned some of those funding here in Israel. Is there any outside funding or influence that's behind these protests?
I did not investigate this issue. I did not investigate this issue. I heard about it. I did not have the time. I had a very busy schedule here in the building to pass these laws. I heard about it. I know for a fact that I checked way before that some of the organizations that are openly behind the protest are actually organizations that getting money from the U.S. State Department. I'm not saying that the U.S. State Department is paying for the demonstration. I'm saying that organizations that are getting money from the U.S. are involved. They are getting the money, they say, on other issues, I don't know. But if the other way around would be in the U.S., if an organization that is being paid for, whatever the reason is, paid by the government of Israel, would protest or be active in political debate in the U.S., it will be against the law. In Israel, that happens. I think that any any organization that gets funding from the U.S., whatever the reason is, should be it should be decided by the U.S. administration that this organization shouldn't be involved in the political discourse in Israel. Again, I'm not saying, and I don't want anyone to say maybe it is, maybe it's not. I don't know. I did not check that this is paid by the U.S. administration. That I'm not saying. Mm-hmm. What I do say is that organizations that are on the payroll of the U.S. government are involved in the protest, and that I checked. Mm-hmm. And they are getting money for many years, for many reasons. And I think that's in the equivalent wouldn't be accepted in the U.S.
What impact is this having around the world, these protests, these delegitimization of not only Netanyahu, but the government? And what impact is it having?
I think that it shouldn't have an impact on what we are doing. I think that friends of Israel, and we hear those voices and it's becoming stronger, always say, we friends do not intervene in inner issues, in the process, in the division of power between the court and the legislator and the executive of their friends. I would never think to try to apply pressure on my friends in U.S. Congress about the issues of the court, of the U.S. Will they decide about abortions or not? I don't think it's my place. And it shouldn't be the other way around. In the same way with Canada or the UK or any country around the world that is Israel friend should say, when it's talking about foreign relations, there are issues that are relevant for our mutual interests. It can be trade, it can be a connection with other countries. You know what? Even the Palestinian issue, which also I think suffers a little bit from too much intervention by our friends, but that's a separate issue because it also has international impact. Mm-hmm. Which entity will be to decide on an issue of law, if we'll have a constitutional court or we won't have a constitutional court, if it will be in the high court, it will be lower courts, it will be in the parliament, it will be impeachment, it's not an issue for anyone else to decide. It's an issue for the citizens of Israel in the political and democratic process.
Yeah. How have you seen the media cover this issue?
I think the media in Israel, and of course it affects the media outside of Israel, is heavily biased. For example, the fact that we spoke about before, that this bill, how many people ask around the world, how many people know that what we passed here in the Knesset, leave aside if it's smart, if it's a good idea, opinion. Fact, it was offered by a member of the opposition and the former Justice Minister Gideon Sa'ar, meaning you cannot say it's extreme or strange or something that acts unilaterally. It was offered in the platform. It was offered by a justice in the Supreme Court, in articles, in rulings. It's putting substance to criticism for 40 that has been in the Israeli discourse for 40 years. It's not a new idea. Everything I'm saying is fact. It's not an opinion. You can think it's a good idea, you can think it's a bad idea. But the facts, it was in the coalition agreement in the draft coalition agreement in 2019. It's not a new subject that appeared. It was offered in the Knesset by number of Knesset members, again, including members of the opposition, since 2015. If you read the news in Israel or around the world, you would get the impression that this crazy government got into power and decided, out of think loss, to bring something new that no one ever heard of, to solve non-existent problems, and enforce their own views on the world. That's a lie. It's not about an opinion. That's a lie. That's not a fact. And the fact that no one knows this is because tremendous amount of money was invested in telling those lies. And of course, we have limits. As politicians, we have limits of spending. We have limits of fundraising in Israeli law. So it's not a fair battle. I cannot go around and buy the first page of every newspaper and with a small fact sheet. I cannot. I cannot do it.
But what the opposition has been doing, in addition to taking all the front pages of the major newspapers here in Israel, they're calling this the end of democracy. They're calling that the beginning of a dictatorship. What do you say?
It's not the end of democracy. It's not the beginning of dictatorship. It will introduce, in Israel today, we have self-appointed court. The judges choose their own successors. They can decide. You know what? I'm willing to try to cancel the law whatsoever. If anyone will show me a case in the US where the Supreme Court would go to the President of the United States and tell him, I think Secretary Blinken, is an unreasonable appointment. There is no problem with law. There is no problem in process. He was sworn in, 100% okay. The Senate approved him, 100% okay, but is acting in a very unreasonable way, or people have some thoughts about his appointment. It's unreasonable. I order you to fire Secretary Blinken. If this case ever gets to the court, I'm not even talking about trialed and then made this kind of decisions, I'm willing to cancel all this law. In Israel, we call this situation Wednesday, Tuesday. It happens every day. Every day the court gets some kind of appeal like that, challenging either senior appointment or a major policy decision, only because someone thinks it's unreasonable. You don't need to show basis in law. You don't need to show that the problem with due process. If someone thinks your policy is unreasonable, he can take you to the court, to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will say, okay, now tell me why it's reasonable. Convince me. Like, start all over again. Where's separation of powers? We don't have separation of powers in this manner. We don't have, and keep in mind that the court is not elected in any democratic way. So when the public in Israel, the example, I gave one example, I can give many. It can be an issue of not appointing someone because he supports dodging the draft, as I said. The court enforced, our friends around the world, we tried to tell them, please pass anti-BDS laws. It's important. We can ask for that. We are promoting it, not actively, not lobbying, but every country that will do it, we say, wow, thank you. Thank you for your friendship with Israel. Thank you for not accepting these vicious lies against the state of Israel that calling for BDS, right? In Israel, the Supreme Court enforced the minister to give the highest civil prize in Israel Prize, to someone who promotes BDS. No, the minister said, I'm not giving a prize to someone who promotes BDS, who calls for BDS on the Israeli academia. The court said, no, it's unreasonable. You have to give him the prize. So it's not based on law. There is no law saying you should get the prize. But the court says it's unreasonable based on the political ideas of the judges, not based on law, not based on legal reasoning. And that's it. So this kind of decisions we want to prevent. We are trying to protect the court from getting into the political sphere, because court that is politicized is losing the public trust. I know that some people see the same way in the US. In a very strange way, the Democratic Party, the vice president, the president himself, speaks about the Supreme Court of the US in ways that I would never speak about in our courts. I respect our courts more than the equivalent of the Democratic Party dealing with the recent rulings by the Supreme Court of the US. I don't want the Supreme Court to be involved in politics. They want to politicize the court to their other way. I'm not calling to discipline judges that do not rule the same way I want. I just want separation of powers and democracy.
Right now, there looks to be a situation where NGOs have already appealed to the Supreme Court to invalidate the Prime Minister and this law. So what happens when you get to the...
I think I made my point. Can you imagine this kind of appeals going to the Supreme Court of the US?
Yeah.
No, you can't.
Yeah.
You can't. And the fact that this happened, and the fact the court willing to hear those kind of cases, shows you how important it is to introduce separation of powers, checks and balances, and democracy to the system in Israel. I couldn't give better examples than what we see now. The fact that the Supreme Court is willing to talk about kicking out the Prime Minister out of office without any basis in the law, or canceling a basic law, which for many years they said that's the equivalent of the Constitution. Can you imagine after the Civil War in the US, where the people of the US made the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, can you imagine the Supreme Court says that's unconstitutional, we are canceling the 14th Amendment? That's the equivalent. So the fact that these cases are litigated as we speak just proves how urgent is the reform.
What's going to happen? Is there going to be a showdown now when the Supreme Court here may rule on the reasonableness law? And what if they say it's unreasonable?
Again, if the Supreme Court is not bound by laws or by basic laws, where's democracy? Where's the rule of law? The same way you could ask me what would happen if the Supreme Court would tell us to go to war against Syria or Jordan, I don't know. If there is no limit to the power of the court, and the court can decide on basic laws, that, on the Constitution, the quasi-semi-Constitution, then the need for separation of powers and the need for the reform just shouts.
Yeah. So is this part of a basic law?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes. It's an amendment to the same basic law that created the Supreme Court to begin with. The basic law of judiciary, we amended this and we said, you have all your authorities. You can decide on equality, you can decide on due process, you can decide on anything that you want. There is one thing you cannot do, is to go to elected officials, highest ranking elected officials, and tell them that they acted lawfully, but you don't agree with them, and therefore you're canceling their decision. And if that's a problem for the court, it just shows how far away from any reasonableness is the situation that the court having in Israel.
Just a day or two after the vote, do you see more civil disobedience, even civil war, what Ehud Olmert's talking about and Ehud Barak?
No, I don't see more. I don't see more. I think that the majority of even the protesters are not willing to risk the security of the state or to act in violence. Sadly, as the numbers of the protesters was going down, the less protesters, more violence. That was created, and the violence by few protesters, and the fact. But to talk about the protesters is the easy way out. I think it's very dangerous that the President Herzog or the leaders of the opposition said nothing about the fact that we had January 6th right here. People got cut the fences of the Israeli parliament and barged in. People were going around and prevented Knesset members from coming to vote while shouting democracy. What's democratic about blocking Knesset members from voting? That's the opposite of democracy. The fact that we are having this conversation when they shout democracy and they're calling for military coup, they're shouting democracy and preventing member of Knesset from voting. They're shouting democracy while trying to shut down anyone who thinks differently. We are the democracy. We are in the Knesset. We want democracy and separation of powers in Israel. They lost elections. They're torching down the country because they do not accept the vote of the people. It's not about minority rights. We have minorities in our coalition. The ultra-Orthodox are a minority in Israel. We have a gay speaker. We have diversity. We have Sephardim and Ashkenazim. We have secular and religious. We're a very diverse coalition, despite the lies that are spread out around the world. We are very diverse. they're not protecting minority rights. They're protecting the minority right to rule without being elected. That's not a right. That's a privilege.
They claim that this will not only the reasonableness, but the judicial reforms that seem to be proposed down the line will not protect minority rights like gays or Messianics, Palestinians, even Christians.
They say a lot of lies, so I can just say it's not true. I cannot, again, see the coalition. Last coalition, there wasn't any ultra-Orthodox, which is a large minority in Israel. It's a minority it's poor people. They're being attacked sometimes, sadly, on the streets because of their looks. They're very distinct. It's very easy to know who is ultra-Orthodox, and sometimes they suffer violence or discrimination. They weren't in the government last time. They did not account for them. We are a very diverse coalition dealing with minorities. Nothing in the legislation hurt minorities. The reasonableness clause, the judges' selection system. Again, there is a small minority in Israel that was used to the fact that he can rule the state of Israel without being elected. Through the courts, through the legal advisor, through through the fact that they have maybe more pilots than the other groups of society. That's not a way to rule a democracy. Democracy is by the people, not by a small elite group that protects its privilege. I think that anyone who knows about the history of the United States knows that the best way to ensure freedom of religion is to have religious people set the rules. Because when you're religious, you're very, very careful not to allow anyone to enforce their views of religion on you. Therefore, the founders of the United States many of them were deeply religious people. They put in the Constitution not to enforce religion on people. We are a coalition that the majority of the people are religious. We know how terrible it would be if we start fighting and imposing the views of Shas on the views on Yahadut HaTorah, on us. We are different in our views, and therefore there is nothing in the reform that even getting close to imposing problems with freedom of religion or imposing religion on people. You know, the funny thing is we're getting criticized on a law saying you're giving too much power to the rabbinical court. What is the law that they're attacking us on that like crazies. What is the law? The law says that if two sides agree to go to the rabbinical court that is operated by the country in Israel, you know, we don't have a separation of a church and state or synagogue and state, if you want. And every religion has its own courts for family law. The Christians, denominations, the Muslims, and of course the Jews. We have rabbinical court, and it's operated by the country. But if two people agree that they want to have a civil dispute in the rabbinical court that exists in Israel, we want to allow them to do so. Now, it was the situation in Israel from the founding of the State of Israel until the year 2000, when the court canceled it. And we want to bring back this situation, again, two consenting adults who wants to go to a rabbinical court and have them decide the dispute with agreements. That's a coercion. It's really not based on facts. It's based on fears. It's based on hatred sometimes. Mm-hmm. It is not based on facts.
Yeah. There was one law proposed, I think it was proposed, but never voted on, never gone to committee. A couple of months ago, there was some news about it. I think it was UTJ, that any attempt at conversion or changing somebody's religion would be a crime.
So in Israel, that's a very delicate subject because of specific history of the Jewish people, and that's the law today. The law today is that trying to convert people from a religion to religion in Israel is not legitimate. Of course, we don't enforce on anyone to become Jew or Muslim, and it's something that it's not okay in Israel. But still, it has not been voted on. But again, that's the situation today in Israel, that you cannot try to convert people from a religion to religion. As Israel is very unique in its acknowledging the existence of religions. We have the government acknowledge certain religions. We have a rabbinical court. We have Christians courts. We have Jews courts. We have, and it's all operated with the government. It's a complicated system to get into it. We got it from the Brits before and the Ottomans. It's a complicated system that shows our history and the complex issues of religions in a country that holds sacred areas for and sites for all major religions. For people looking from outside, it might look strange, but there are churches in Jerusalem that you cannot move a ladder. I don't know if you know this story, without the approval of the prime minister, because we don't want to have a religious war.
Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, said that the vote the other day was the darkest day in Israel's history. And is there concern that you have about, with the internal division here in Israel, that Israel's enemies will be emboldened by that, whether it's Hezbollah, Iran, or Hamas?
So I don't want to go to the place when I say that there were many people that were happy on this vote and thought that it's good for Israel. And there is a shared view between some people that usually I call them the enemies of the state of Israel, sometimes sadly, that think that it was not a good day for Israel. I think it was a good day for Israel. I think it was, I understand the sadness of the people who lost elections. Every time you make a decision against the will of the opposition, they are sad. But it's part of the rules of the game. It's not something out of this issue. And about the division, I think I said before, the division has nothing to do with the judicial reform. We had 5 elections in 3 years because of the division. What we see now is maybe the beginning of the cure to the divisions that we had for many years. I wrote a book, and the last sentence in my book, in Hebrew it's Mifleget Bagatz, the ruling party of Bagatz. English, well, when it will come out in English, we'll find a different title, because I don't think it means a lot to the American audience or English speakers. But the last sentence in the book is a quote from an American judge, learned hand, that was quoted by our Chief Justice Landa. And he said that a society that is reaped, that does not have, I'm translating back to English, so don't try to find a direct quote, but because it's translated from Hebrew. But a society that is ripped apart, no court will help it from not being ripped apart. A society that is not ripped apart does not need a court to protect it. And a society that counts on the court from saving it from being ripped apart will find it that they lost what keeps them together. The court cannot solve those problems. Only the parliament can. There is no country in the world that went from democracy to non-democracy because they rearranged the courts. There are many countries in the world that became undemocratic because of people attacking the parliament or going around Knesset members and intimidating them or trying to apply outside pressure against the democratic process. That is a way from democracy to authoritarianism. Reforming the courts, there is no country in the world that went from democracy to authoritarian system with reforming the courts.
It also says in the Psalms that when brothers dwell together in unity, it's like the oil running down the beard of Aaron. How can people pray for Israel during this time of deep division so the oil can be running down Aaron's beard?
I think that call for unity is important. I think that we should be united. I saw a very nice video of someone goes and asks people in the streets, are you for or against the reform? If someone told him he's for, he said he's against, but give me a hug. If someone told him he's against, he said, I am for, and gave him a hug. Because it's really this issue, specifically as it passed, it's an important step, but there is not any reason that it will be a source of division. I think time will give the perspective, but I think our friends should give us the trust and support to solve those issues in the Israeli democratic way. And for our enemies, I think the message should be always very clear. Never think that because we are fighting together, we will not be united if you try to attack us or try to harm us. The divisions that were in Israel during 1948 war were much larger than today. People actually shot at each other. When there were a ship that was brought by the Etzel people, Altelena, burning near the shores of Tel Aviv, because it was bombed by the IDF. And still, under attack, we are united. Against our enemies, we are united. And at the end, we are united, despite all challenges.
One other question. The opposition says that there was no compromise. I mean, it seems like you've said, they wouldn't compromise. Well, tell me about the negotiations. Were they willing to compromise at all?
Sadly, no. Even when they put, I can tell a lot of stories on the process, but I think it will bore the listeners or the viewers. But I think the last example, is the best. They offered more than 27,000 reservations to this bill. It's one small paragraph, 27,000 reservations. And we voted here like that for hours to decide that it stays. And in the beginning of the votes, we calculated time. The legal advisor for the Knesset told them, you have three options. Choose one or two reservations that you think is important and negotiate on it. Now, even after all the legislation went through, and try to reach a common ground from the 27,000 reservation you offered. And then, in return for the coalition accepting it, take down a few of the reservations so you won't have this long filibuster, which does not make any sense. And that was one of the options. The other two was to negotiate few important reservations. Not a single reservation from those 27,000 reservations was to the point and something to negotiate on. They couldn't say, as an opposition, this is important for us. If you give us this, we are waiving our objection. You don't even need to support, just don't object. Not a single reservation out of 27,000. I think that tells the story.
Is there anything you'd like to add, Simcha?
I hope, and I think on those days specifically, we should pray for the peace of Jerusalem, but we also for the unity of the people of Israel. And Bezrat Hashem, I'm optimistic in the long run always, but always also in the short run.
Thank you, Simcha. Appreciate it.
Thank you.